The main street lay drowned in red dust and searing heat. Men sprawled before the saloon, smoke curling from their lips, eyes half mocking, half indifferent. Women clung to one another's arms, whispering, their words cutting through the air like knives. Into this scene walked Annie Callahan, a 22-year-old black girl in a faded gray dress with frayed hem, each step of her boots striking the boardwalk like a drumbeat against the contempt the town cast upon her. That wild girl. Who'd ever take her in? The whispers clung tighter than desert dust. Annie was used to it, yet her heart still clenched when she saw other young women giggling in their white dresses. Then, sudden hoofbeats split the heavy noon. Out of the rising haze appeared a tall figure on horseback, his deep blue gaze settling on Annie. Not with scorn, not with derision, but steady and unshaken. In that fleeting instant, his look stood apart from every glance she had ever endured. Annie's hand tightened around her basket, her heart giving a tremor. Could this be the first man willing to see her for who she truly was? Cottonwood Springs, 1876. The small town straddled a red-dusted trail where wind drifted down from the western mountains, leaving the air hazed over, as though dusk never quite lifted. At high noon, the heat stretched across every porch step, turning the boards into burning plates. Men in wide-brimmed hats lounged before the saloon, cigarettes hanging loose on their lips, eyes following each passerby. Women in long skirts clutched their baskets close, whispering as they walked. In that scene, every footstep of Annie Callahan seemed to stir whispers louder than the clatter of hooves on dirt. Annie, a 22-year-old black girl, moved quietly down the main street. Each step kicked up red dust, clinging to the frayed hem of her faded gray dress, layering her lean but unyielding frame. Her dark eyes held steady forward, though her ears caught every murmur drifting from under shaded porches. There she goes again, that Callahan girl. Wild, no sense of decency. Who'd ever want her for a wife? The words might have been as fleeting as the wind, but they clung tighter than desert dust. Annie didn't have to turn to know the eyes pinning her back. Looks of disdain, of cold indifference, some sharp as thin blades against her skin. She was used to it. Since 17, when she'd been seen swimming in the creek with boys her own age, the word wild had stuck fast. The water then had been clear as glass, sunlight breaking into silver shards, laughter ringing out, innocence without sin. But a single curious glance, a single repeated rumor, twisted the memory into shame. Wanton, shameless. At 19, when a rich boy from town tried to corner her behind the abandoned schoolhouse, Annie had fought back. Her fist landed square across his face, blood spilling from his nose as he howled and spread the tale everywhere. No one asked why she had to defend herself. They only whispered, "That girl's vicious. No man would dare take her." After her parents died, life pressed her into every odd job she could find. Some nights, she carried trays at the saloon, wiped tables, gathered empty bottles left by drunken hands. Every coin scraped together meant supper the next day. But the town only needed to glimpse her in that room thick with liquor and laughter to decide. She's no better than the women who sell themselves. Piece by piece, memories were bent into stains. The creek, the punch thrown in self-defense, the work at the saloon. Each whisper hammered another nail in the coffin of her so-called virtue. Still, she walked on, chin lifted, worn heels striking firm against the boards. Inside her chest, her heart beat steady, unwilling to let weakness show. Yet for an instant, as she glimpsed other girls arm in arm, white dresses flowing, laughter bright as bells. A hollow ache opened inside her. They would be called good daughters, chosen as wives, stepping onto church aisles to blessings. And she, just a name, for ridicule. The noon sun made the town shimmer. The sign of the general store creaked in the wind, throwing crooked shadows on the ground. Annie paused, wiped sweat from her brow, and stepped inside. Mrs. Winters, the shopkeeper, gave her one sharp glance, then turned away to fuss with tins already in order. Annie forced a smile, offered a greeting, but the only reply was a cold huff. She was used to that too. Through the years, doors of courtesy had quietly shut in her face. No one struck her, no one drove her out, but the way they turned aside, the way greetings thinned to nothing, carved the distance deep. Annie gathered what she needed, set her coins on the counter, and turned back to the street. Outside, the wind whipped the red dust around her skirt. From the saloon, from the porches, from eyes that slid away, the whispers wound together like thorn vine, binding her tighter. That girl. No man would take her. She'll die in that shack at the edge of town. Someone like her will never be called a wife. Annie drew a long breath and walked on. Dust thickened over her boots, yet it also covered the tracks she left behind. In this small, unforgiving town, the whispers never seemed to fade. They clung to Annie Callahan as though intent on sealing her fate in a sentence already passed, the sentence of a woman deemed unworthy of love. Leaving behind the watching eyes of Main Street, Annie Callahan followed the dirt road that led to the far edge of Cottonwood Springs. The path narrowed until it was no more than wagon ruts pressed into cracked earth. The desert wind blew against her, flinging red dust into her skirt and hair. In the distance, her shack appeared beneath a scattering of lonely birch trees, its gray shingles sagging at one corner, the brick chimney blotched and weathered by time. That was Annie's home, a place no one in town cared to visit, save for a few curious children who were always called back before they reached the porch. The shack was worn, small, but hers. Its wooden walls were split with cracks, paint peeling to expose the dark grain beneath. The window glass was clouded, etched with long scratches. Yet inside, Annie kept it tidier than its face suggested. She hung her old hat on a nail by the wall, folded her scarf neatly upon the table, and bent to coax the fire in the stove. Ash stirred up, the scent of charred wood rising, warmer than the dry chill of late afternoon. She added logs, set a black iron pot above the flame, poured in cornmeal and a handful of dried beans. A humble supper, but enough to keep her warm. Sitting down, she drew needle and thread to mend the rip at the hem of her dress. The stitches were neat, though the fabric was thin and nearly spent. Her eyes drifted toward the pile of clothes fading in a wooden trunk at the corner of the room. All she owned amounted to little: a few sets of worn garments, an old wool blanket, her father's dagger, and scraps of paper. On the table beside the dim lamp, Annie picked up one such scrap torn from an old flour sack. She sharpened a charcoal stub and began to write. It wasn't truly a diary, more fragments, thoughts, dreams, sorrows, sometimes just a single line. Today, the sunlight fell across the porch, warm but lonely, sometimes longer. If ever a pair of eyes looked at me without judgment, I think I would cry. Those uneven lines were her way of holding on to a self the town would never recognize. Outwardly, Annie stayed composed. Entering a store, she kept her back straight, offered greetings. When someone muttered a cruel word, she lifted her chin and walked on. But at night, when only the wind whistled through the cracks, she sat by the window, staring out at the boundless prairie. It stretched silver under the moonlight, vast enough to swallow her solitude whole. In those moments, she felt herself no larger than a fleck of dust adrift in the desert's emptiness. Some nights, wolves howled in the distance, mingling with the scratch of wind against the door. Annie pulled a blanket around her shoulders and thought of her parents, her father, dead too soon on a silver-seeking trail in the mountains, and her mother, unable to bear grief, slipping quietly from life not long after. At 16, Annie had been alone, teaching herself to cook, to work, to withstand the town's sharp tongues. Each night, those memories wrapped her like armor, though they left a hollow carved deep within. In the silence, she carried a quiet yearning, that one day someone might see her as she truly was. Not the wild girl of gossip, not the saloon girl of rumor. Only Annie Callahan, the woman who could cook a simple stew, mend a dress, ride a horse across the prairie, and whose heart longed for a hand to share the weight of her days. That evening, after scribbling a few more lines onto the scrap, Annie closed her eyes a moment, wondering if the wish was too far to reach. Then she shook her head, pressed the charcoal flat to the table, and rose to tidy her space. Surviving day by day demanded enough. She could not afford to let dreams make her weak. The sun slipped behind the ridge of mountains. Its blaze turned to copper, spilling across the shack and the bare ground before it. Annie stood at the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, gazing out. The prairie looked like a sea of fire dimming into violet dusk. Then, through the haze, dust lifted once more, as though smoke heralded a coming presence. From the distance, a small company of riders appeared, hooves striking hard, driving up a cloud of red. Annie narrowed her eyes to see. The group was not large, 3 horses in the lead, a few pack mules trailing. But foremost among them sat a tall man, his back straight, his bearing sure. The sunset traced his wide-brimmed hat in gold, casting a fierce outline along the dust of his coat. He was no man of Cottonwood Springs, new to these parts. Yet in an instant Annie found she could not look away. Her heart gave a sudden, quiet ache. Not of fear, but of something closer to a warning, or perhaps a promise that this arrival would change the course of her days. That man was Elias Dawson. The late summer air in Arizona pressed down heavy, the ground itself seeming to breathe heat from withered grass. Cottonwood Springs was a small town, no more than a red dust street and a line of weather-beaten wooden buildings. But on that afternoon, the town had a newcomer, Elias Dawson, 28, tall and hardened by years of driving cattle across endless trails. He had just bought the Miller Ranch, left abandoned since old Mr. Miller died. The land stretched wide, with a small creek and grazing ground. Though the fences sagged, the barn lay empty, and the main roof leaked in half a dozen places. Most townsfolk called it cursed ground, a place of bad luck because its owner died alone. Elias didn't care. He'd spent nearly 10 years pushing herds from Texas to Kansas, saving every coin. Now he wanted a place to settle, a patch of earth to build something lasting. His horse snorted as he led it into the livery stable at the end of town. The long wooden shed carried the smells of straw and manure. The moment he swung the door open, a boy of 12 came running, eyes bright as stars. "Howdy, sir. Fine horse you got. Must have come a long way." Elias nodded, handing him the reins. "From Prescott. Think you can handle him?" Yes, sir. I'll feed and water him right. The boy tied the horse quick and sure, then looked up. You new to Cottonwood Springs? Yeah. Elias rested his hands on his hips, exhaling. Name's Elias Dawson. Just bought the Miller place on the edge of town. The boy's eyes widened. The Miller Ranch? You gonna bring it back? Folks left it for dead. Elias gave a faint smile. I like a challenge. The land's still good. Just needs a man willing to work. The boy lowered his voice, suddenly eager to share a secret. If you need someone real capable, I know a lady. A lady? Elias arched a brow. Annie Callahan. The words tumbled out quick, as though he feared someone might overhear. She rides and shoots better than most men here. I saw her myself, raced a horse down a rocky hill, and still shot tin cans clean, every one. A flicker lit in Elias's eyes. A woman who could ride and shoot wasn't rare in frontier lands, yet the boy's earnest tone carried something more. So, where does she work? Elias asked. The boy sighed. That's the trouble. Nobody hires her proper. Some say she's too weak 'cause she's a woman. Others say it's because she's colored. Elias paused, his blue eyes sharpening. A crease drew across his brow, though his voice stayed even. And what of it? Round here, the boy shrugged. People make much of that. She only gets scraps of work, washing for Mrs. Johnson, helping at the saloon sometimes. She deserves better. She's strong, never afraid of the hard stuff. But he trailed off, as though words couldn't cover the weight of injustice. Elias fell quiet. In his mind, a picture formed of this woman, one chained by gossip, yet somehow stirring a strange curiosity. He'd traveled far, met all kinds. He knew some bore labels not because of who they were, but because of how others chose to see them. The boy spoke again, lively. I'm Tommy Dawkins. If you want, I can show you her shack. Out past the birch trees, she's lived alone for years. Elias chuckled, patting the boy's shoulder. Tommy, you've got more wind than the desert. But thank you. I'll remember. His gaze turned distant. Inside his chest rose a restlessness he hadn't felt since first leaving Texas, stepping into unknown country. Outside, the day's light shifted to honey gold, spilling over dusted rooftops. Hooves echoed down the street, lifting red haze into the air, folding into the breath of a town that seemed quiet, yet brimmed with unspoken things. Elias slipped off his gloves, his deep-set eyes fixed on the empty road. In his mind, the name Annie Callahan had already struck deep, a woman spurned by the town, yet defended by a boy's unshaken voice. A rider, a sharpshooter, forced to scrape by with the jobs no one wanted her to take. Something in him tightened, a quiet urge. Perhaps at the edge of this town, beneath all its whispers and prejudice, a story waited for him to set in motion. By late afternoon, the sun dipped toward the western range, painting the sky in a blaze of copper that spilled down Cottonwood Springs' main street, setting the red dust aglow. The batwing doors of the saloon creaked as Annie Callahan stepped inside. The air was cooler there, but heavy with old whiskey and smoke lingering since noon. The saloon was quiet at this hour. A few cowboys sprawled across chairs, hats tipped over their faces in lazy slumber. Behind the counter, the heavy-set bartender, his mustache thick as a broom, polished a glass that never looked cleaner for the effort. Annie carried a basket of neatly folded tablecloths, sun-dried and scented faintly of soap. She walked straight to the bar, set the basket down, and said clearly, "Tablecloths, clean." The bartender gave a curt nod without looking up. Annie paid it no mind. She was used to the indifferent way men here acknowledged her. Usually, she finished her work, collected her coins, and slipped out without fuss. But today was different. A stranger sat at the counter, back straight, eyes following her every move. Elias Dawson. The moment he saw her, he realized she was nothing like the rumors, not the wild, reckless figure whispered about in town. Before him stood a young woman, compact in frame, sun-darkened face yet striking, each gesture precise, her gaze steady and unbowed. Elias turned his glass in his hand, then spoke, voice low and even. "I need someone to help rebuild a ranch. Interested?" The question halted her. Annie's hands froze mid-fold. Slowly, she turned, looking directly at him. For a heartbeat, she saw only a stranger. Dusty shirt, broad shoulders, eyes sharp and blue. Yet in those eyes was no contempt, no cheap curiosity, only a level, measured regard. "You know what they'll say," Annie answered quietly. "They'll call you mad for hiring a colored woman with a name already tarnished in Cottonwood Springs." Elias didn't hesitate. His reply fell steady as iron. "I judge with my own eyes, not with other men's ears." The words landed, simple but heavy as stone. Something inside Annie trembled. For years she had heard nothing but condemnation, never once a voice claiming to see her on her own terms. The bartender cast a quick glance, frowning, then turned away, feigning busyness. A few cowboys nearby lifted their heads, squinting. Elias ignored them all, waiting only for Annie's answer. She gathered the last of the folded linens, her tone calm but guarded. "Easy words, but the moment I set foot on your land, this town will have new gossip, and I'll be the reason they scorn you." Elias leaned slightly forward, his gaze unwavering. "Let them talk. They don't live my life." Annie's grip tightened on the cloth in her hands, a knot rising in her chest that was part bitter laugh, part unexpected warmth. She was used to refusals, to eyes that turned away. Yet here was a man, fresh off the trail, knowing nothing of her past, ready to face the town's judgment head on. The saloon grew strangely still. The clink of glass, the soft snore of a cowboy, all fell to the background. Annie heard the beat of her own heart, and faintly, hoofbeats outside on the dusty street. She lifted her head, meeting Elias's eyes once more. In their blue depths she read not conquest, nor careless charm, but a steady curiosity mixed with resolve, the kind belonging to someone who had crossed wide country and weighed all sorts of souls, not the sort who used, then discarded, the sort who kept his word. "Mr. Dawson," Annie said, speaking his name for the first time, almost as if testing herself. "I haven't said yes." "And you haven't said no," Elias answered, smiling faintly, the lines at his mouth etched by years of weather and work. Annie turned away, lifting the empty basket. She didn't reply, only pushed through the bat-wing doors. The last rays of sunset cut through the slats, streaking her faded gray skirt with a brief flash of light. Outside, the wind stirred red dust into the air, cloaking the corner of the street. Annie clutched the handle of her basket, her thoughts tangled. She knew his offer might be a chance, or a new weight to carry. She walked faster, as though to shake off the saloon's closeness. But in her chest, a seed had already been planted, a seed of doubt and of hope. That seed, though she wouldn't admit it yet, had begun to sprout the moment Elias Dawson said, "I judge with my own eyes, not with other men's ears." At first light, Before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Annie had already bound up her belongings. A small oak chest held nearly all she owned: a few worn dresses, the old wool blanket, her father's dagger, and the scraps of paper she wrote on. Beside it she packed a black iron pot, a wooden ladle, a basket of dry rations. A lifetime's worth of possessions, neat on the back of her dark bay mare. Annie stroked the horse's mane, steadying both the animal and herself. The road out to the Miller Ranch, now Elias Dawson's, was choked with dust and scattered stones. Annie rode at an easy pace, her chest caught between hesitation and resolve. She couldn't be certain of what she was riding into, only that his plain words in the saloon had planted a fragile trust. Elias was different. His eyes carried no pity, no judgment. Most of all, he'd told her he chose with his own sight. The ranch rose out of the flatland, solitary and worn. The house sagged, roof punctured with holes, windows shattered, fences leaned and rotted. The barn tilted, its doors hanging loose. Weeds had taken the yard whole. The air smelled of mildew and wet wood. Annie tightened her grip on the reins. This was no easy place to live, but the bones of it still stood, waiting to be built back. Elias was there already, sleeves rolled high, hammer in hand as he nailed fresh planks over rot. When he saw her arrive, he dropped the tool and came forward. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face at her choice to come. "Your cabin's over there," he said, pointing to a low-roofed shack under the birches. "Old, but the frame holds. Needs patching. It'll serve." Annie nodded, leading her horse to the place. Inside was bare. An iron bed frame rusted at the joints, a small hearth, one dust-choked window, dim and plain, but it was hers, a corner where no eyes judged her. She set down the chest, spread the cloth she had brought, then returned outside. The work began that day. Together they cleared the stables, hauled out broken timbers, heaped rubbish into piles for burning. Annie's arms knew such labor. Sweat darkened her shirt, but her movements stayed steady, uncomplaining. Elias, watching, found himself surprised. He had worked alongside many men on long cattle drives, yet few matched her endurance. In some ways, she was neater. The posts she set stood straighter, the earth tamped firm. They split the fencing between them. Elias cut new stakes. Annie dug holes and set them. Each shovel stroke was firm, each swing clean. More than once Elias paused, seeing her keep pace with ease. By evening they moved to the yard. Weeds were cut, brush uprooted, the ground uncovered stone by stone. The house still stood in ruin, but it looked less forsaken. When the sun threw its last blaze, Elias stood with hands on hips, sweat streaking his brow, dust clinging to his shirt. He glanced at Annie, perched on the step, pulling off her dirt-caked boots, chest rising quick from the day's strain. Yet her sun-darkened face held no complaint, only the gleam of quiet pride. "You work as hard as any man," Elias said, half praise, half fact. Annie lifted her chin, a wry smile touching her lips. "Better than some, if it comes to that." Elias laughed, a short, true sound. In that moment, the line between them shifted, not master and hired hand, but two souls hauling together at something broken. Night fell. Fire cracked in the yard, the smoke sweet with burned weeds. They sat close, few words, listening to the snap of the wood. Elias studied her in silence, the sun-creased hands, the hardened palms, and yet the deft way she stirred stew with a wooden spoon. She asked for nothing, offered no boasting, only steady labor. He thought of Tommy's words at the livery. The boy had been right. Annie was not like the rest. Now Elias had seen it with his own eyes. Not only her skill with horse or rifle, but her strength, her endurance, and that guarded dignity she carried. And Annie, glancing at him, saw he too was unlike the men of Cottonwood Springs. He gave no harsh orders, showed no pity. He worked beside her, sleeves rolled, shoulders bent. And when he spoke, it was without condescension or flattery, just the simple respect of one person to another. They said little, yet the silence between them was full of something unspoken, a rhythm already shared. The Miller Ranch, abandoned just yesterday, now breathed with signs of life. And from that day's labor, Elias understood. The girl the town scorned was not only stronger than he'd guessed, but sharper, swifter, more steadfast than many men he had trusted before. Night fell quickly over the prairie. When the sun sank behind the western ridge, darkness rushed down like a tide, swallowing the half-mended fences and the sagging house still waiting for repair. Only a small fire burned before the cabin, its glow flickering in the wind, a fragile warmth in the vast chill of open sky. Annie bent over the camp stove, her hands swift and practiced. An iron pot sat on the coals, steam rising with the scent of dried beans and a handful of vegetables she had gathered, mingling with the smoke of burning wood. It was a humble stew, no spices, but salt and pepper. Yet when ladled out, the heat rose like comfort itself, chasing back the desert night's cold. Elias sat across the flames, hair damp with sweat from the day's labor, dust smeared across his face. He lifted the bowl Annie handed him and tasted. The beans were soft, the broth rich, the flavor balanced. He looked up, surprised. "This is good," he said, plain and true. Annie shrugged, a quick smile flickering. "I've cooked since I was little. When my mother was alive, she taught me to make do with whatever was at hand. She always said, 'As long as it fills your belly and keeps you standing, it's worth more than gold.'" Elias nodded, quiet, finishing every spoonful. When the bowl was empty, he paused, then chuckled. "I've eaten stews on every cattle trail across Texas and Kansas, but this is the first one that made me scrape the bottom and still want more." Annie laughed, free, unguarded. The firelight caught in her dark eyes, softening them to a glow rare in her face. For a moment, the hard lines she carried seemed gentled, revealing something feminine and hidden. Elias said nothing, only watched. Yet he felt something shifting between them. After supper, they sat by the fire. The wind keened through the prairie, but within that small circle of light lay a cocoon of warmth. Talk turned to childhood. Elias spoke of Texas, of riding herd at 14, sleeping under the stars. Annie spoke of her mother, tender yet unyielding. She always said a girl out here had to ride, had to shoot. No one protects you better than yourself. Annie's eyes stayed on the flames. Elias listened, his face solemn. She must have been strong. She was my whole world. Annie smiled faintly, though her voice caught. She died young, but what she taught me stayed. I think, without her, I wouldn't be here at all. The wind stirred the ashes, sparks spinning into the dark. Elias only nodded, eyes lit with quiet understanding. That night, for the first time, Annie felt less alone in telling her past. Someone had listened without judgment. The fire painted their faces in shifting light, laying memories and present moments together in the glow. At dawn, hoofbeats broke the stillness outside. A wagon stopped at the gate. A woman sat tall on the seat, dress prim, hat trimmed with feathers, eyes sharp. Mrs. Bennet. She was the voice of the Swan, town's women, her opinion enough to decide a person's standing. Elias was by the fence checking posts when her call came. He wiped his hands and approached. "Mr. Dawson." Her voice was sweet, edged with steel. "I hear you've taken on a certain young woman here." "Yes," Elias answered evenly. "Annie Callahan. She's skilled, steady, and knows her work." Mrs. Bennet's eyes narrowed, her lips curling faintly. "You're new here. You don't understand. Keeping company with her sort is unwise. People will talk, and talk in Cottonwood Springs carries weight." The warning fell heavy as stone. Elias's reply came calm, unflinching. "I trust my own eyes, not other people's tongues." Mrs. Bennet faltered. A flicker of displeasure crossed her eyes before she masked it with a brittle smile. "Well then, good luck to you." She turned her reins and the wagon rolled away, dust curling in her wake. From the small cabin window, Annie had heard every word. She stood pressed against the frame, hand resting on the wood, her heart trembling. For years she had known nothing but scorn and backs turned against her. Now, for the first time, someone had stood before her, answered on her behalf, without a moment's pause. Her eyes blurred. A heat rose in her chest. Strange, tender, almost unbearable. She pressed her lips tight, unwilling to let tears fall. Yet her heart felt as though it had found a shelter it never knew existed. And in the wind sweeping the prairie, Annie whispered to herself, "For the first time, someone didn't turn away." That year, the harvest came early. Around Cottonwood Springs, the fields of wheat turned gold, corn hung heavy on the stalks, and wagons loaded with grain and produce rumbled steadily into town. The air carried a festival charge, women with baskets of flowers, men raising poles for decorations, children laughing as they tumbled through piles of drying straw. The harvest dance, the town's grandest event of the year, was close at hand. For the people here, it was both celebration and spectacle, a place to boast, to bargain, and to let rumor flow freer than whiskey. Elias Dawson watched the bustle while buying nails and tools for the barn. Standing by his wagon, arms folded, his eyes carried a glint of interest, a touch of thoughtfulness. He hadn't lived long in Cottonwood Springs, but he understood enough. The festival was where every gaze converged, and he wanted Annie beside him. That afternoon, as they hauled timber for the north fence, Elias glanced up from the load and asked without preamble, "The festival's coming. Go with me." Annie's hands faltered on the rope. She didn't lift her head, only answered slowly, "I've had enough of whispers at those gatherings. You don't know, but I do. They don't want me there." Elias studied her face, steady. "Whether they want it or not has nothing to do with us. I want you there, with me." Annie pressed her lips tight, shaking her head. "You don't understand. The moment I step inside, they'll whisper. They'll look at me like a stain against all those pale dresses. I won't make myself their amusement." She bent again to the rope, as though to close the matter. Elias didn't push. He only nodded, turning back to the work, though his eyes held a firm light. Days later, as the wind carried the scent of ripe grain and wood smoke from the town, Annie had just kindled her stove when hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin. The door opened, and Elias entered, a small box in his hands, wrapped in dark blue cloth and tied with twine. "What's this?" Annie asked, frowning. "Not borrowed," Elias said, setting it on the table. "A thank you." She hesitated, fingertips brushing the coarse cloth. It held the dust of the trail, the cool roughness of burlap. She untied the knot. Inside lay a dress, simple yet carefully chosen. Cotton in a deep green blue, trimmed in white at the collar, stitched with precision. Not fancy, but new, meant for her. Annie froze. She couldn't remember the last time, perhaps when her mother had sewn for her years ago. Since then, she had worn nothing but mended rags, threadbare skirts. Now before her lay something untouched, made for her alone. "Elias," her voice caught. "You shouldn't have." "Only thanks," he answered evenly. "You've done more than I hoped. This ranch wouldn't stand again without your hands." Annie smoothed the fabric, her fingers trembling. The cotton was soft, strong, and her heart beat along, unsteady. Not for its price, it was modest enough, but for what it meant. Recognition. "You know," she whispered, eyes lowered, "if I wear this to the festival, they won't see the dress. They'll only see me, and they'll say what they've always said." Elias was silent a long moment. Then he stepped closer, voice firm. "Let them talk. Folks will always find reason to look down. But I see you different, and I trust my sight." Annie looked up. His blue gaze struck hers, and something in her chest ached, then softened. She had built walls for years, hard and high enough to keep herself alive. Yet with a few plain words, this man had shaken their foundation. She pressed the dress to her chest, saying nothing. But inside her heart stirred, as though some long-buried spring had broken through dry earth. That night, she spread the dress across her narrow bed. Moonlight slid through the window, glowing on the green-blue fabric. Annie sat long, tracing each seam with her fingers, her thoughts tangled. Part of her yearned to wear it, to walk beside Elias with her head high. Another part trembled, afraid the whispers would cut her raw again. The wind rattled the boards, crickets trilled in the fields. Annie closed her eyes, asking herself if just once she could allow someone to believe in her. The answer was not yet clear, but from the moment she touched the dress, one truth stood firm. She no longer turned away from the thought of standing beside Elias before the eyes of the town. That fragile seed, though small, had been planted and waited for the day it would break ground. The night of the harvest dance arrived. Cottonwood Springs gleamed brighter than ever. The town hall, usually bare and somber, now glowed under rows of oil lamps strung along the porch. Wreaths of dried corn and bundles of husks hung at the doors. Long tables were spread with white cloths, heavy with pies, baked apples, and jugs of cider. Inside, fiddles played quick and sharp. Drums beat time. Laughter mingled with the thump of boots on the wooden floor. Elias stood near the entrance. Clean white shirt, plain black vest, hair combed neat. He didn't smile much, only waited steady, his eyes fixed on the door. It swung open, and Annie stepped inside. In that instant, the hall seemed to falter. The fiddle sagged off note, conversations died mid-word. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. She wore the green-blue dress Elias had given her. The cotton clung simply to her frame, setting off her sun-warmed skin, her dark, deep eyes. Her hair was tied back with a strip of white ribbon. No jewelry, no lace, nothing ornate. Yet that plainness cut sharp against the swirl of satin and frill around her. Whispers darted through the crowd. She dares show herself? Look, new dress, likely begged for it. Eyes clung to her, some mocking, some curious, some cold. Annie felt her heart pound hard, her hands tremble. One more step, and she would turn and leave. But Elias's hand was already there, warm, steady, closing firm around hers. "With me," he said, voice low but sure. "Forget the rest." He led her straight to the center of the floor, beneath the great golden lamp hanging from the ceiling. The crowd drew back, a circle opening wide. Every eye followed, whispers rising, then dimming again. Annie trembled. Elias's hand rested firm at her back. She lifted her gaze and met his eyes, blue, unwavering. They told her, "No one else matters here but us." The music struck up again. At first her feet locked stiff, but Elias's steps were slow, certain, guiding her. His hand never loosened, steadying her as the dance carried forward. Gradually she let go, her body finding the rhythm. Her skirt spun lightly, the green-blue fabric catching the lamplight like moonlit water. The fiddle quickened, boots pounded, laughter swelled, but to Annie it all blurred away. Only her heartbeat remained, her breath, and Elias's arm guiding her through the steps. For the first time in her life, she felt herself equal, not hidden, not belittled. A woman in the open, in the light, with a man who chose to lay his hand at her back and move with her. The song ended. Applause rang out, but along its edges rose a new wave of murmurs. Annie faltered, eyes dipping, hand twitching to pull away. But Elias held firm, leaning close to say, "Don't. They'll tire before we do. Let them look." Annie bit her lip, then nodded. The next tune leapt up, lively, bright. She laughed, this time truly. A laugh no one had seen in the market, nor in the saloon, nor on the dusty road. Fire lit her eyes, and it made Elias laugh too. Rare, unguarded, easy. They spun together, giving themselves to the music. Other couples joined, the hall buzzing again. The whispers thinned, swallowed by stomping boots and swirling skirts. Yet Annie knew the talk of her and Elias would not end here. When the song closed, Elias bowed, his hand still clasping hers. Annie bent in return. The clapping rose, not only for them, but for all who danced. Annie lifted her head, drew a long breath. Beneath the blaze of the golden lamp, she knew something had shifted. She was no longer only the shadow at the edge. The harvest dance stretched on into the night, but for Annie that first moment had been enough. For the first time she had been seen, not as the name they slandered, but as herself. Elias left the ranch on a brisk autumn morning, the mountain wind carrying a dry chill down into the valley. He sat tall in the saddle, a leather satchel of banking papers slung at his side, bound for Denver. Annie stood at the gate, reins of her mare in her hands, watching. 2 weeks only, Elias said, a faint smile at his lips. When I return, I'll bring good news. Annie only nodded. She was used to farewells, but with Elias, the emptiness struck sharper than ever before. As his figure dwindled into the red dust of the trail, her heart felt pressed beneath an invisible stone. The first day passed almost like any other. She spent the morning mending fence posts, replacing wire where it had snapped. Alongside Frank and Harvey, she stacked firewood for the coming winter. By evening, she sat at the rough-hewn table in her small cabin, opening the leather-bound journal Elias had once given her, a gift that had left her silent with surprise. On its first page, in her own neat script, she wrote, "Day 1 without Elias. I'll keep my word. Guard this land as he guards it." The days fell into a steady rhythm. At dawn, Annie rode the fields, checking water, clearing stones from the path. At midday, she cooked for the crew, setting their meal on the wooden table. At night, when all others slept, she lit her oil lamp and filled the journal's pages. They weren't fancy words, only fragments. A stray calf, a gust tearing the porch roof, the hoot of an owl too close in the dark. Yet in each entry, Elias lived, present in her thoughts, though absent from her sight. One afternoon, she rode into town for supplies. The harvest had swelled the streets. Wagons lined the general store. Neighbors bartered, preparing for winter. Annie kept her hat brim low, slipping inside. But it wasn't long before Mrs. Bennet appeared, spine rigid, eyes sharp, fan flicking in her hand. "Well," her voice rose for all to hear, "Miss Callahan, still scraping by with odd chores? A woman like you is fit only for pennies, not for any man's home." Her laugh was quiet, but it cut deep. She looked Annie over, slow and cruel. "Don't dream otherwise." The store fell hushed. A few pretended to busy themselves. A few glanced with faint smirks. Annie stood straight, clutching her cloth bag tighter. She gave no reply. Words could not wound her as they once had, yet they struck the tender place inside, that hidden dream she never dared confess aloud. She turned and left, walking quickly into the dust-blown street. By the time she reached her cabin, her chest was tight. She lit her lamp, set pen to page, and wrote in bold strokes, "Someday, I will prove it with the life I live, not with pleas, not with defense, but with work, steady, upright, unbowed." Her hand trembled, but her eyes blazed clear. She understood at last. Her worth was not weighed in whispers. It lay in the fences she set straight, the cattle she kept, the fire she tended each night, the ache of missing. Elias remained, but now it mingled with resolve. She told herself, when he returned, he would not find a helper at his side, but a partner, one who shared the weight of the ranch. Night fell, wind sliding through the cracks. Annie closed the journal, rested her hand on its leather cover, and whispered like a vow only she could hear, "My life, I will write it myself. No one else holds the pen." When Elias left Cottonwood Springs for Denver, Annie thought those 2 weeks would be nothing more than waiting, filling the days with the usual labor until his return. But each day showed her the gap he left behind was more than an empty seat at supper or an absent hand in the fields. It pressed into the smallest choices. Elias was no longer there to ask, to give that steady nudge forward. Instead, every eye turned to her. Frank, Harvey, and the hired hands all looked to Annie, waiting. At first, she stumbled. She had spent years working alone, answering to no one but herself. Yet now, with new cattle in the pens, fences unfinished, and winter closing in, without direction, everything would fall apart. Annie drew a deep breath, steadying the tremor in her chest, then spoke with even calm. "Frank, take a group and check the west pasture. Harvey, fix the water trough by the creek. I'll finish the fence line." The words were simple, but firm. The men nodded and carried on, without protest. By day's end, work had flowed smoother than Annie imagined. That night, she opened the leather journal and wrote, "Turns out I can decide." And they listen. In the days that followed, she fell into the rhythm. She mapped work by the week, the way Elias often did. When sudden rain soaked the ground, she weighed her choices: delay haying to keep it dry, or haul timber before the roads turned to mud. Each choice felt like a test, and each one left her stronger. What surprised her most was how the men began to look at her, no longer with doubt, no longer working only from duty. Respect settled in. One evening, Frank, usually silent, muttered, "You plan things cleaner than Elias himself." The words struck her still, warming her, stinging her eyes at once. Annie began to understand. Pride did not grow from what the town whispered, nor from dresses or festival applause. It was forged in the life she lived daily, in sweat on her brow, in the fence set straight, in the herd driven home safe. People could talk as they pleased, but truth lived in the work of her hands, in the land running because she tended it. At night, by lamplight, she wrote, "Self-respect is not granted. It lives in each choice I make. Each morning I rise, I choose to live upright, to give all I have. That is the only answer needed." And yet, however busy the days, Elias's shadow ran through them all. With every choice, she wondered, what would he say? Would he agree? Sometimes she caught herself smiling at a memory. His voice, the faint curve of his mouth watching her mend a post, or that steady look when he told her, "I trust my own eyes." One evening, as the sun bled red over the hills, Annie rested against her hoe, eyes on the wide fields. Wind swept through the golden grass, new fence stretching far to the horizon. In that stillness, truth struck sharp. What she felt for Elias was no passing thing. It coursed through her like an underground stream, stronger than she had dared to admit. It was more than gratitude for the chance he gave her, more than respect for his regard. It was kinship, the rare recognition between two souls who knew loss, who bore burdens alone, who stood against the weight of others' eyes. In Elias, she saw not just a partner in labor, but someone who understood. That night, in her small cabin, Annie wrote one line, her hand unsteady but clear. "I have lived a life called by names not mine. But when Elias looks at me, I see myself." She closed the journal, her hand resting on the cover, heart trembling. This quiet was no longer idle waiting. It was recognition. Annie knew when Elias returned, nothing between them would be the same. An invisible bond had been drawn, taut and sure, and this time she would not turn away. The red dust road from Denver to Cottonwood Springs glowed under the late sun. Wagon wheels rolled steady, horse hooves drummed a lively beat. After 2 long weeks, Elias Dawson finally came home, the old leather satchel at his side heavy with bank papers stamped in red. The loan was approved. What he had worked toward for years was now real. He drew a deep breath as the town rose on the horizon, the prairie wind carrying scents of dry grass and wood smoke, sharp and familiar. Yet his heart beat faster for a reason beyond banks or cattle. It beat for someone waiting. When the wagon halted at the ranch gate, Elias saw her. Annie stood by the fence, hammer in hand, hair tied back, stray strands clinging to her damp brow. At the sound of hooves, she looked up and her dark eyes lit, not only with surprise but with a quiet relief. "You're back," she said, voice low, trembling faintly. "Back," Elias answered, a rare smile breaking across his face. He swung down, handed the satchel to Frank, and strode straight toward her. In his eyes, she was no longer the outcast woman he had first met at the edge of town. In just 2 weeks, she had changed. There was a confidence in the way she held herself, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. That evening, as Elias walked the ranch, he saw it clearly. Fences lined straight. The cattle barn swept clean, new troughs filled, the herd well tended. When he asked, Frank nodded toward Annie. She called every shot. She runs the place. Annie stood nearby, head lowered modestly, saying nothing. But Elias caught it in her gaze. A newfound strength. No longer just a hand to labor. She was a partner, someone to shoulder weight alongside him. Later, as dusk fell, they sat near the fire pit. Annie stirred the coals with an iron rod, the sparks rising into the violet sky. Elias studied her face in the firelight, tired, smudged with dust, but lit from within by a quiet pride. He realized, with a jolt that made his chest tighten, that she had not only kept the ranch alive in his absence, she had made it stronger. The next morning he asked her to ride north. They climbed the slope, autumn wind rushing, the hills alive with wildflowers, purple, gold, and scarlet spreading to the horizon. They stopped atop the ridge. The world stretched vast and still beneath them. Elias dismounted, stood beside her. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes on the sweep of land, as though measuring his words against the endless sky. At last, his voice came quiet, deliberate. This place needs a name. Annie turned, surprised. A name? Yes. Elias nodded. A ranch can't be just earth and fence posts. It needs a spirit. And I think this land needs someone to hold it with me. The words carried heavier than any paper from Denver, heavier than any brand on cattle. Annie froze. The wind tore at her skirt, heart pounding hard, yet she did not look away. She knew what lay beneath his words. It wasn't just about land or labor. It was a proposal, plain and steady, from a man who knew his mind. She thought of the years behind her, the whispers, the sharp laughter, the long nights when she believed no one would ever stand at her side. She thought of the first time Elias had looked at her without judgment, the first time his voice had cut through the lies the town told about her. Now here he was, asking not for her help, not for her labor, but for her presence, her place beside him, as equal and as partner. In that instant, every whisper of the town, every scar of the past fell away. Annie no longer heard Mrs. Bennet's sneers or remembered the stares in the saloon. She heard only the wind and Elias's voice, calm, sure, as wide and deep as the prairie itself. Their eyes met. And for the first time, Annie did not see herself beneath anyone's shadow. She stood level, equal. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, but in that moment, the world had narrowed to two people on a ridge, and the promise of what they might build together. Elias reached out, not hurried, not demanding, but steady as the land itself. Annie's breath caught. Her hand trembled once, then found his. In that touch lay every unspoken word, trust, hope, and the fragile, fierce beginning of something that could not be broken by dust or rumor. That spring, Cottonwood Springs once more gathered for its festival. But for Annie it was no longer a night of faltering steps beneath the lamps, nor a chorus of whispered scorn at her back. This time she stood at the center, every gaze upon her, and before them all, Elias Dawson reached out and took her hand. With the wind sweeping across the hillside, among the gold and violet wildflowers, his voice rang without hesitation. Before every watching eye, I choose you. The words shattered every chain of judgment that had bound her. Years of ridicule dissolved into dust, leaving only a silence heavy with wonder. Annie did not answer in speech at first. Her eyes shimmered, her lips trembled. Then, slowly, she nodded. One nod, and her world turned new. Their wedding came under a flawless sky. Wildflowers carpeted the slopes, wind carrying their fragrance. The townsfolk, some still cautious, could not ignore the plain truth of Elias's devotion. He wore a simple black vest, nothing grand, only clean and honest. Annie wore a modest white dress, sewn by the hands of women from town, a small gesture, but proof that the old walls of disdain were beginning to crack. They stood side by side, hand in hand, eyes fixed on each other. As their vows carried on the breeze, blossoms stirred and scattered like nature itself bore witness. Cheers rose, applause thundered, and in Elias's arms, Annie felt lifted, not diminished, seen not as lesser, but as equal. That day, a new name was spoken: Wildflower Ranch. The name came from the hillside blooms, but meant more. It marked the woman once scorned, now blooming proud and unyielding, beautiful in her own way. Life rolled forward, season by season. In summer, the cattle grazed along the wide meadows, and Annie rode out beside Elias, her skirts tucked and her rifle steady across her lap. In autumn, they harvested hay, stacked high in the barn, while the children tumbled in the straw, their laughter rising like song. In winter, the house glowed with firelight, neighbors stopping by to share coffee and stories. For Wildflower Ranch soon became known as a place where no one left unwelcome. The house grew into a wide, warm home. The stables doubled, cattle herds swelled, their calls echoing with children's laughter. Annie herself oversaw much of it, hiring hands, teaching them, earning their respect not through Elias's name, but her own steady leadership. Men who once might have mocked her now tipped their hats in earnest gratitude. Two children, a boy and a girl, ran barefoot in the yard, cheeks flushed. The girl giggled atop a pony, while the boy tucked wildflowers into her hair. Annie stood at the porch, wiping her apron, her face lit with joy as Elias strode from the barn, dusty but smiling, scooping the children into his arms before pulling Annie close, their laughter tangled together. But Wildflower Ranch was no longer only their private haven. It became a gathering place for the town folks came not just to buy cattle or hire horses, but to linger on the porch with Elias and Annie, sipping coffee as the prairie wind drifted by. Women began to seek Annie's counsel, asking her how to mend accounts, how to sew for the winter, how to keep their dignity when the world seemed unkind. She taught children their letters at the kitchen table, and her firm yet gentle hand turned neighbors into friends. The whispers were gone. In their place rose respect, gratitude, and something rarer, trust. People who once doubted her now looked to Annie Callahan Dawson as a pillar of their small community. One spring evening, as the wind once more swept the flowered hills, Annie and Elias sat on a bench, their children tumbling in the grass below, sunlight spilling across the fields. Annie whispered, almost to herself, "They once told me I wasn't fit to be anyone's wife." Elias turned, eyes deep and steady, clasping her hand. Annie smiled, her gaze clear now, no longer shadowed with pain. She finished softly, firmly. "But it turns out, All it takes is one person willing to believe. The wind carried the fragrance higher, and on that hill they knew some stories need not be written in town ledgers. They were already carved into the land, into the hearts that lived there. Annie Callahan, once the outcast, was now wife, mother, the heart of a home, and a part of Cottonwood Springs itself. Some love stories need no grand drama, only quiet endurance and trust. Annie Callahan, once shunned, had found her home at Wildflower Ranch, with a man who dared to see her and believe. Like wildflowers rising from barren earth, their love bloomed quietly yet proud, bringing peace to all under its shelter. And perhaps at our age we have each known whispers, wounds, or moments when we doubted our worth. This tale reminds us, with one honest heart, one hand that holds on, we too can find the place where we belong. If you find yourself in Annie and Elias's story, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and pass this story along to friends of your generation, so we may keep alive these gentle love stories of the Old West.